Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Instead of a creation myth or a creationist trick, today I have something a little looser, a little more fun. Today I want to talk about Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson from Answers in Genesis, because Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson thinks you're stupid. Yes, you. People who agree with him, people who disagree with him. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson thinks we're all stupid. Let me show you. Before we get into Dr. Jeanson's attitude towards his audience, let's just build the character a little bit. So Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has a Ph.D. from Harvard University from 2009 in cell and developmental biology. If you've ever heard any creationist ever talk about Dr. Jeanson, you know that he has a Ph.D. from Harvard because they bring it up every time Jeanson comes up. Don't believe me? Just like Google him, go on YouTube, you'll see, trust me. Literally every time. So Dr. Jeanson, straight out of school, he starts at ICR, that's the Institute for Creation Research, and now he's over at AIG, where he's been for most of his creation science career. So here's his little bio header from Answers in Genesis, where he is called a research biologist. Now, let's get to the point of this little discussion. Dr. Jeanson thinks you're stupid. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. 3 ways we know that this is his attitude towards his audience. But really, we're just setting up for item number 3. That's the fun one. We'll get there. Don't worry, I promise. So the first way we know that Jeanson thinks you're stupid is he has said outright, I am going to lie. But he still apparently expects to be taken seriously. And if you don't believe me, you can look this up yourself. It's still, for some reason, online, and the link is down below in the description. So this is from his kind of little entry press release interview from when he joined ICR, right? New ICR research associate, Nathaniel T. Jeanson, Ph.D. This is from 2009. In this piece, he said, and this is him saying this is not a misquote, this is not somebody taking his words out of context, he said this about himself. He said, I asked myself, how can I use and abuse my training to influence eternity rather than for temporary gain? How can I use and abuse my training? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The second thing that Dr. Jeanson has done that tells you he thinks his audience is stupid is that he has written big long things with lots of numbers and math, and it looks all sciencey. And then at the end, he'll point out the flaws in it. Like he'll say, oh yeah, disclaimer, like blah, 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 blah. If you know what to read, he actually provides a disclaimer for his own work. But then he goes on acting like it's fine. My favorite example of this is in a piece he wrote for Answers Research Journal, which is not an actual peer-reviewed journal. It's the Answers in Genesis like blog pretending to be a research journal. He wrote this piece called A Young Earth Creation Human Mitochondrial DNA Clock. Whole mitochondrial genome mutation rate confirms D-loop results. We don't need to go into the nuts and bolts here. I actually have a creation myth on this exact argument that Jeanson makes, and I've linked that down below, so you can check that out if you want all the details. But the thing is, the math that he does requires that the mutations he's talking about are passed on generation to generation. In other words, they have to occur in the germline of the individuals who were surveyed for these mutations. Now, at the end of this piece, he writes a very important paragraph. He writes, the only remaining caveat to the present results is whether the mutation rate reported in Ding et al. 2015, and that's he didn't collect his own data, it's that Ding et al. 2015 paper, was the source of the raw data that he used to write this blog post. Whether the mutation rate reported in Ding et al. 2015 represents a germline rate rather than a somatic mutation rate. Now, that's not the only caveat. There's like a lot of things wrong with this work. But that is a huge problem with this work. If the mutations that he was tallying up represent a somatic mutation rate, meaning mutations that occur anywhere in the body, not just in the germline, then all of the rest of the work he did is invalid. Now, it turns out that those mutations that Ding et al. Presented in their 2015 paper, those do represent a somatic mutation rate. I know this because a friend and associate, David Neff, he actually emailed Ding and asked, and Ding explained that you can't distinguish germline from somatic mutations in his work. So Jeanson's work is flawed for the exact reason that Jeanson says it is. No, Jeanson did not check on that. I think, reading Ding's work, it's apparent that it's a somatic rate rather than a germline rate, and I would expect Harvard PhD Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson to come to the same conclusion. But he still presents this work as though it's fine. He doesn't do many public appearances, and certainly basically no adversarial public appearances anymore, but he did do a debate with Dr. Herman Mays one time, and in that debate, Dr. Mays brought up this problem, and Jeanson basically waved it off and acted like his work is fine. So that's the second way you know that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson thinks his audience is stupid. But it gets so much worse. I give you the worst argument I have ever heard. Okay, that's probably an exaggeration because I've heard creationists make some really bad arguments, but this one is definitely up there, and it's one of my favorites because it is so blatantly obvious that nobody, not even Jeanson, should be taking this argument seriously. But here it is. Dr. Jeanson makes the argument that development from zygote to adult frog takes less than 3 years, so it's perfectly reasonable to think that all of the cats, for example, could evolve from the arc pair of ancestral felids in about 4,000 years. Because after all, there's way more phenotypic change between the zygote and the adult frog than between all of the different cats that live, and he doesn't mention this, but of course all of the extinct felids as well. That is a serious argument made by somebody who is supposedly a serious person, somebody who holds a Ph.D. from Harvard University, lest we've forgotten. This argument was made in a piece Dr. Jeanson co-authored with Jason Lisle, also for AIG, in Answers Research Journal. It's called On the Origin of Eukaryotic Species, Genotypic and Phenotypic Diversity, Genetic Clocks, Population Growth Curves, and Comprehensive Nuclear Genome Analyses Suggest Created Heterozygosity in Combination with Natural Processes as a Major Mechanism. That is a mouthful. I'm going to link this down below in addition to the mitochondrial one I referenced earlier. The relevant figure from this post that I want to point out to you is figure 2, and lest you think I am unfairly characterizing the argument, I assure you it is exactly as bad as I have presented. Here's the figure. Development, zygote to frog, less than 3 years. Speciation, ancestral cat to all the living cats, less than 4,365 years. And I'm just going to read this figure legend, again, from Jeanson and Lisle, just so we're clear that this is the argument they're making. Figure 2. Phenotypic change on various timescales. The wood frog develops from a single cell to a sexually mature adult in less than 3 years, undergoing massive phenotypic transformation in the process. By contrast, over the course of 4,365 years, the 37 cat species that exist today arose from a common felid ancestor, a much smaller level of phenotypic change. Thus, producing extensive phenotypic species diversity in a few thousand years is not an unreasonable postulate. So I just want to make sure we're all clear. Jeanson is defending this notion of like creationist hyper-evolution, right? You have a pair of organisms that get off the arc that are representative of lots of living species today. And evolutionary biologists will correctly point out that you don't have, there's a lot of problems here, right? Like first, you don't have 4,000 years. You have only a few hundred years because by like Middle Kingdom Egypt, like you have all the living cats, right? So you only have from like 2000 BC to some hundreds of years later, right, BC, to get all the extant things. So it's not 4,000, it's like a few hundred. Putting that aside, whether you use 4,000 or 400 years, the rate of speciation for these big groups starting from a single pair is bananas. That's not realistic. So what Jeanson is arguing is, what do you mean that's not realistic? We go from zygote to a frog in like 3 years. So why can't I go from an ancestral cat to a bunch of different cat species in the same amount of time? That's the actual argument he is making. Now, there is no way that Jeanson actually thinks this is a good argument. He 100% knows better. He knows why this is bad, right? Remember, he's a PhD from Harvard in cell and developmental biology. So like, he knows how these processes work. But just in case, let's review. Let's compare development to evolution. Development is a process that takes place in individuals. Individuals develop from a zygote to an adult. Evolution is a process that takes place in populations. Populations evolve over generations. Development occurs within a single generation, right? It's one individual going from a zygote to an adult. Evolution occurs over multiple generations. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve over generations. And development involves a process called mitosis. This is a type of cell division, how you get from a zygote, one cell, to a multicellular adult, a lot of cells. You go through this process called mitosis. This is where one cell divides into two, and each of those two cells are clones of the parent cell. So you stay the same as you go through this process of development. Evolution, on the other hand, involves lots of genetic changes over generations, right? So development and evolution are two different processes, and Dr. Jeanson knows the difference. But let's ignore all that. Let's pretend that that argument actually makes sense. Let's follow it to its logical conclusion. If one cell can grow into an adult frog in less than 3 years, and that means the ancestral cat pair can speciate to all the extant cats in about 4,000 years, doesn't that also mean that some ancestral unicellular organism can evolve into all the extant multicellular organisms in billions of years? After all, it's approximately the same level of phenotypic change that we see in that 3-year development from a zygote in frogs, but instead of having 3 years to accomplish it, we have billions of years. Does Dr. Jeanson not realize the implication of the argument he's making? Of course he does. He just thinks his audience won't make the connection. Now, I want to end this with some bonus content because it is actually funnier than what I've already presented. Because this argument that he makes is so bad. How bad is it? It's so bad, it was literally a joke someone made as a parody of a stupid creationist argument. So here's this thread on the Peaceful Science Forum. This is from September of 2021. It's Dr. Joshua Swamidas, who kind of runs Peaceful Science. And by the way, everyone should check out Peaceful Science. It's a really cool place. A lot of scientists talking about evolution and creationism and stuff. Go check it out. It's fun. I'll link this down below so you can see it firsthand if you want. So Josh posts this article, single cells evolve large multicellular forms in just 2 years, blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, cool. Another user, Thoughtful Valerie, makes a joke. Single cells evolve large multicellular forms in just, and then she substitutes 9 months and says, isn't that how babies are made? That's a joke, right? That's making a joke. But that's the argument that Jeanson actually made. And I pointed this out, right? So this other user said, Thoughtful wins the internet, right? Thoughtful wins the internet with that joke. And I said, you joke, but Jeanson actually literally made this argument for real. I got the citation wrong. I said it was in Replacing Darwin. I corrected it later in the thread. But I want to point out that this was a joke that a young Earth creationist user made as ha ha ha, isn't this a silly argument? But it turned out that this is actually an argument for real that Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has made. It's an argument so bad that people unaware that Jeanson has made this argument, made the same argument as a parody of a bad argument. So to summarize, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson of AIG has a Ph.D. in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University, and he thinks that his audience is stupid. How do we know this? Well, he told us that he was going to lie, and yet still expects to be taken seriously. He knows his work is flawed. He says so outright, points out these specific problems, but then pretends it isn't and just acts as though the work is fine. And the best/worst of all is he made an argument so bad that somebody literally made the same argument as a joke. An argument so bad that the only reasonable explanation is that either he's stupid or he thinks his audience is. And remember, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson has a Ph.D. from Harvard University, and don't you forget it. Which means Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson thinks you're stupid. Thanks for watching.